He grew up in front of America's eyes, but almost no one knows the price he paid when the cameras turned off. Ron Howard was the child the nation adored, the young man Hollywood underestimated, and the director the world later praised, only to watch him fall, rise, fall again, and keep walking through storms that would have broken most people long before. Behind the smiles, behind the awards, behind the gentle face everyone trusted, lived a lifetime of pressure, rejection, loneliness, crushing failures, family battles, grief, and the fear that he would disappear before he ever discovered who he truly was. This is not the story of a Hollywood legend. This is the story of a boy forced to grow up too fast, a man who spent decades rebuilding himself, and a human being who learned again and again that resilience is earned, not given. And at 71 years old, the truth is finally clear. Ron Howard's greatest performance was not on screen. It was surviving everything life tried to take from him. What happens to a child when the world claims him before he can even say his own name? This question sits at the beginning of Ron Howard's life, because from almost the moment he was born, his path was pulled away from anything normal. Ron came into the world on the 1st of March 1954 in Duncan, Oklahoma. His parents, Rance and Jean, were working actors who loved performing but struggled with steady income. They were young, hopeful, and trying to survive in a profession where every month felt uncertain. Their small family moved often, and nothing ever felt fully stable. Bills came fast, opportunities came slow, and the future was always unclear. Even in these early years, Ron was growing up inside a life shaped by adult worries long before he could understand them. His parents believed acting was the only way they could build a better future. So they kept pushing, searching for any chance that could help them move forward. When Ron was still a baby, not even 2 years old, they made a bold decision. They packed up their belongings, left Oklahoma behind, and traveled to California. The hope was simple. In Hollywood, maybe their dreams could grow. But none of them imagined that it wouldn't be the parents who broke through. It would be their toddler son. Ron entered Hollywood at just 18 months old. He was not old enough to talk clearly, not old enough to play normally, not old enough to understand anything about the world he was being pulled into. His first steps were not on grass or playgrounds. They happened on studio floors, surrounded by adults rushing around, carrying equipment, smoking, talking loudly, and adjusting lights that were too bright for such a small child. He didn't get to ease into childhood. His earliest memories came from film sets, where long hours and chaotic environments were normal. Studios in the late 1950s were not child-friendly places. Smoking was common. People shouted instructions across rooms. Equipment clattered. Schedules were tight. Crew members argued. Nothing in that environment belonged to a child. Yet Ron spent his days there, sitting quietly, watching adults who were stressed and tired, learning early that it was his job to behave perfectly so no one would get upset. He learned obedience not because he was naturally quiet, but because the world around him demanded it. His schooling was nothing like other children's. California law required child actors to study 3 hours a day, but these hours didn't happen in normal classrooms. They took place in small trailers behind sound stages. These trailers were cramped and gray, and the sound of production equipment often filled the background. Ron tried to concentrate while grips shouted instructions nearby or dragged heavy objects across the floor. Sometimes cigarette smoke entered the trailer and made his eyes burn. There was no school playground waiting for him, no recess bell, no group of classmates he could laugh or run with. There were teachers, yes, but not the kind of friendships children need to feel normal. Ron studied beside adults and other child actors who came and went, leaving no chance to build real bonds. By the time he became Opie Taylor on The Andy Griffith Show in 1960, he was only 6 years old, but millions of Americans already saw him as their television son. People loved him, but that love came with an invisible cost. When the world embraces a child through a screen, that child often loses the chance to grow up quietly. He was admired by millions, but felt alone in daily life. Even at home, the pressure often followed him. He had to be professional, polite, and ready. There was no space to make mistakes or have outbursts the way other children did. School. Outside the studio wasn't easier. Kids didn't see him as a classmate first. They saw him as Opie. They used the character's name to tease him, twisting it into jokes like dopey, mopey, or soapy. These words stung because Ron never wanted special treatment. He wanted to blend in. Instead, he felt singled out everywhere he went. Some boys mocked him in the school bathroom, and after a while, he became afraid to go inside. One day, he held in his fear and discomfort too long, and he ended up wetting his pants in public. He never forgot how humiliating that moment felt. It marked him deeply, reminding him that fame could not protect him from the cruelty of other children. Even on set, the pressure sometimes became too much. During the filming of The Music Man when he was around 8 years old, he panicked during a dance routine. He whispered to Shirley, "Jones, I can't do it," his hands shaking. The fear wasn't just about performing. It came from the belief that disappointing adults around him was the worst thing he could do. He carried that fear quietly, trying to stay strong. But inside, he was just a little boy afraid of letting people down. Still, even in these stressful moments, Ron rarely complained. He learned early that staying calm, listening carefully, and doing what was asked helped everyone around him. Adults praised him for being mature and professional, but they didn't see the sadness behind that maturity. He had no real childhood to fall back on. He had no freedom to explore who he wanted to be. He simply adapted to survive in a world he didn't choose. Yet, in this loneliness, something important began to grow. Ron started building a quiet strength. He learned how to handle pressure, how to observe people, how to stay patient, and how to keep going, even when things felt unfair. This early resilience didn't erase the pain, but it helped him shape himself in ways he would only understand later in life. The world saw a sweet, talented boy on screen. They didn't see the child sitting alone behind a trailer, eating lunch by himself, or the boy who wished someone would invite him to a simple playground game. They didn't see the fear behind his smile, or the confusion that came from being loved by millions, but known by almost no one. But the spotlight that raised him would soon try to imprison him, and the world wasn't ready for what that would do to his identity. What if the role that made you beloved also became the cage that kept you from ever becoming yourself? This question became the center of Ron Howard's teenage years, because the success of The Andy Griffith Show was both a blessing and a burden. The show made him a household name. Viewers loved Opie Taylor so much that they began to connect Ron's entire identity to that character. For the audience, Opie was innocent, sweet, polite, and full of warmth. But for Ron, being Opie meant that the world decided who he was, long before he had the chance to figure it out himself. As he grew older, the character did not grow with him. Opie stayed young, simple, and unchanged, but Ron was entering difficult years where emotions, questions, and personal challenges naturally grow much heavier. He wanted to explore who he was, but everyone around him treated him as if he were still that small boy holding Andy Griffith's hand. Even at home or at school, people talked to him like Opie, not like Ron. That kind of attachment from the public can be comforting for a while, but when a child enters their teenage years, it becomes suffocating. As Ron grew taller, his voice changed, and he started becoming a young man. Something strange happened. Casting directors began to turn him away. They loved him, but only in one version, Opie. Over and over, he heard the same quiet rejection. "You're too recognizable, too Opie." They didn't mean to hurt him, but it hurt all the same. He felt stuck inside a character he no longer fit. His face, his voice, his name, everything about him reminded people of a little boy he had already outgrown. It became almost impossible for him to move into more mature roles. He tried anyway. He worked hard on new auditions, hoping to be seen as something different. One of those early attempts was The Monroes, a show that seemed like a chance to break free from the Opie image. But when the show was cancelled after only one season, the disappointment hit him harder than he expected. He didn't blame the writing, the timing, or the network. He blamed himself. He thought maybe he wasn't good enough. Maybe he had already peaked as a child and would never find success again. That fear stayed with him far longer than anyone knew. Even with these struggles, he continued acting, and in 1974 he got the role of Richie Cunningham in Happy Days. He hoped this show would finally help him step into a new phase of his life. Richie was older, more expressive, and had more room to grow than Opie ever did. But once again, an unexpected shift happened this time, right in front of him. The audience fell completely in love with the character of Fonzie, played by Henry Winkler. Fonzie's cool, confident personality became the heart of the show, and very quickly, the attention moved away from Ron. Ron respected Henry deeply and never blamed him for this. But being overshadowed on your own show is painful, especially when you're still trying to escape the shadow of an old character. Interviewers began asking him uncomfortable questions like, "Does it bother you that Fonzie is the real star of the show?" Executives focused more on Fonzie's scenes, merchandise, posters, interviews, almost everything centered around the new star. Ron didn't fight it, but he felt the emotional weight of becoming invisible in his own workplace. It was a new kind of hurt, not loud or dramatic, but slow and quiet. During this period, Ron began to realize something important about himself. He loved storytelling. He loved understanding how scenes worked, how actors brought characters to life, how directors shaped whole worlds from behind the camera. He started paying attention to how shots were planned, why certain decisions were made, and how stories were told. This interest didn't come suddenly. It grew slowly over years of watching talented people on set. And as he watched, he felt a quiet spark inside him. He didn't talk about this spark openly. He simply began studying, directing on his own, in small ways, during breaks on set. While other actors relaxed or joked around, Ron often stood quietly in the corner, watching how the crew worked. He asked careful questions. He observed lighting choices, camera angles, and script changes. He wanted to understand everything. Deep inside, he felt a truth he didn't say out loud yet. "I don't want to stay in front of the camera forever." This new desire was not a rejection of acting. It was a search for something more fulfilling. Acting had given him fame, comfort, and opportunities, but it also trapped him in roles that no longer matched who he was becoming. Directing felt different. It offered him freedom. It allowed him to build stories instead of just fitting into them. It gave him a sense of control he never had as a child actor. But he also knew that stepping away from acting too soon could be risky. So, he began living a double life. On the outside, he was still Richie Cunningham, smiling for the audience, delivering lines, and being the reliable, wholesome character people expected. But inside, he was turning into a student of filmmaking. He borrowed equipment, practiced techniques, read everything he could, and slowly built confidence in his ability to create something of his own. This phase of his life was full of confusion. Half of him was grateful, half felt trapped. He knew people loved him, but he also felt that love was locking him in a box. He didn't want to disappoint audiences, but he also didn't want to lose himself. He walked a thin, emotional line every day, trying to stay strong while the world kept pulling him back into versions of himself that no longer matched his heart. Ron's teenage and young adult years were full of these mixed emotions. success that didn't feel like success, fame that felt like pressure, and opportunities that came with painful limits. But through all of it, he kept going. Quietly, carefully, patiently. He didn't know where directing would take him yet, but he knew it was the only path that felt like his own. But the storm building inside him wasn't just about who he was on screen, it was about who he was terrified he might never become. Some dreams aren't born. They're carved out of doubt, failure, and nights where no one believes in you but yourself. For Ron Howard, becoming a director was not a smooth or easy path. It was a long climb, filled with fear, pressure, and the constant worry that people still saw him as nothing more than the little boy from Mayberry. Even after years on Happy Days, he sensed that acting alone would never give him the life he wanted. He felt a deep pull toward directing, even though almost no one believed he could truly make that jump. The transition from actor to director was not simple. Hollywood had watched Ron grow up. They admired him, but they still saw him as a safe, sweet, dependable actor. People were unsure if he could lead a full production or handle the stress that came with it. Ron knew this, and it pushed him to work even harder. He understood that his first few films would shape how the industry viewed him for years. One mistake early on could shut every door he hoped to walk through. His real test arrived with Night Shift in 1982. This film was the first major project where he had to prove himself as a serious director. He felt the weight of every decision. He was young, he had no major directing reputation yet, and he knew the crew was watching him closely, wondering if he could handle it. Ron worked long hours, constantly checking notes, planning scenes again and again, and trying to balance confidence with humility. He was scared, but he didn't let it stop him. He pushed himself through every moment of doubt. When Night Shift was released, it performed better than people expected. It didn't break records, but it earned solid numbers and positive reactions. For Ron, it wasn't just a win, it was proof he could survive in this new role. Instead of celebrating, he felt more relief than joy. It was his first real breath after years of holding everything together. But his next challenge was far bigger. In 1984, he directed Splash, a fantasy film about a man falling in love with a mermaid. Many people doubted the movie. They thought it was too strange, too silly, or too risky. The special effects were difficult for that time, and Ron was still learning how to manage large productions. Crew members worried the film might fail. Studio executives weren't confident. Ron felt the pressure from every direction. He worked harder than ever before. He spent hours trying to make the mermaid sequences look believable. The costume was heavy, uncomfortable, and difficult to manage. Ron had to stay calm, patient, and focused, even when things went wrong. But he trusted the story. He believed in its heart, and he believed in himself, even when the industry didn't. When Splash became a surprise hit, earning nearly $70 million, everything changed. Ron finally earned recognition as a director, not just as an actor trying something new. People started to see that he could handle bigger ideas, bigger risks, and bigger expectations. This success helped him rebuild his image, one frame at a time. But success also brought new pressure. Now people expected him to deliver again and again. After Splash, Ron, he wanted more control over the stories he created. He wanted to help shape projects from the very beginning. This desire led to one of the most important steps of his career, founding Imagine Entertainment with producer Brian Grazer in 1985. They were young, ambitious, and ready to build something meaningful. But running a company meant endless responsibilities, scripts to read, meetings to attend, decisions to make, and financial risks to manage. Imagine, Entertainment didn't become successful overnight. It took years of work, planning, and sacrifice. Ron's work ethic during these years was intense. He pushed himself beyond normal limits. He slept less. He worried more. He spent days on set and nights reviewing storyboards or rewriting scenes. People around him sometimes wondered how he kept going. His dedication bordered on self-punishment. He felt responsible for every mistake, every delay, and every small problem. He carried the weight of every project, as if the entire company depended on him alone. Directing gave him something he had never felt as an actor: full artistic control. He could shape the tone, the emotion, the pacing, and the meaning of a story. But with that control came a heavy cost. If something failed, the blame landed on him. If something succeeded, the pressure to repeat it grew stronger. The constant cycle of responsibility slowly drained him, even during the years when his films were doing well. This pressure also affected his personal life. Ron wanted to be a good husband and father, but the demands of directing often pulled him away from home. He missed moments with his children. He missed ordinary family routines. Cheryl carried much of the household alone, while Ron was away on sets for long hours. He always came home with Ron, love, but he also carried stress, exhaustion, and the unspoken fear of failing. There were days when he felt torn between the life he wanted and the dream he was chasing. The world didn't see many of these struggles. To the public, Ron looked calm, polite, and organized. But behind the scenes, he fought through doubt, exhaustion, and fear of disappointing the people who believed in him. He spent nights rewriting scenes, hoping to get them right. He second-guessed decisions. He pushed himself even harder when things went wrong. Every movie taught him something new. Every setback strengthened his determination. Every small victory encouraged him to keep improving. Even in these early years, people around him noticed signs of the talented filmmaker he would become. He had a natural sense for emotional storytelling. He treated everyone respectfully, no matter their job on set. He prepared carefully, listened to others, and handled challenges calmly. He didn't rely on ego. He relied on effort. Slowly, his reputation grew. Actors trusted him. Producers respected him. Crew members appreciated him. And step by step, he grew into the director the world would later praise. But the hardest test was still ahead of him. The biggest challenge of his early directing career wasn't success or criticism. It was a project so demanding that it pushed him far beyond exhaustion, right up to the edge of collapse. Greatness doesn't ask if you're ready. It demands everything, even the parts of you cannot afford to lose. By the time Ron began working on Apollo 13, he already had several films behind him and a growing reputation. But nothing he had done before compared to the pressure, intensity, and responsibility he carried during this project. The story was real, emotional, and deeply respected by the astronauts and families whose lives had been part of it. Ron felt the weight of honoring their truth while creating a film strong enough to reach millions. To make the movie as real as possible, Ron made a bold decision. He planned to film scenes inside NASA's zero-gravity aircraft, often called the Vomit Comet, which created short periods of weightlessness. This required the cast and crew to fly again and again in steep climbs and drops. These flights made even trained professionals sick, and Ron went through them repeatedly. Each session caused nausea, dizziness, and headaches. He tried to stay focused, but the physical toll was real. Still, he kept pushing forward because he believed the film needed authenticity. Every day on set felt like running a marathon. Ron reviewed NASA recordings, read transcripts, studied small details, and worked closely with experts. He knew that one mistake, or even a tiny inaccuracy, could upset the real astronauts and damage the film's credibility. This responsibility kept him awake at night. He felt pressure from the studio, from the public, and from his own expectations. The stress piled up quietly, but steadily. The long hours eventually caught up to him. During a hot and demanding shoot, Ron began to feel lightheaded. The lights were strong, the room was crowded, and he was running on very little rest. Suddenly, his vision started narrowing. Sounds around him faded, and, within seconds, he collapsed. The entire set froze. Crew members rushed to him, worried and shaken. Production stopped immediately. Ron was taken to rest and recover. For about a day and a half, filming remained paused while he slowly regained his strength. The crew realized how much he had been, pushing himself. When he returned to the set, they wore shirts that said "Mission Control." As a small gesture of support and gratitude, they understood how much he cared about the film, and they wanted him to feel supported too. When Apollo 13 was finally completed and released, it became a huge success. The film earned 9 Oscar nominations, received praise from critics, and made hundreds of millions at the box office. People admired its realism, emotional power, and respect for history. But while the world celebrated the film's success, Ron felt mostly tired. The project had drained him mentally and physically. He was proud, but inside, he felt worn out in a way he couldn't fully explain. Only a few years later, he took on another major challenge, A Beautiful Mind in 2001. This film was about the life of John Nash, a brilliant mathematician living with schizophrenia. The subject was sensitive and complicated. Ron knew he had to portray Nash's struggles in a responsible and respectful way. This required deep research. He read books, spoke to experts, studied mental health details, and worked hard to avoid misrepresenting anything. He carried the weight of the story for months. Filming was difficult because the story was heavy. To help viewers feel Nash's confusion, Ron chose to film many scenes without clear signals about what was real and what was a hallucination. This method made the movie powerful, but it also affected Ron. He spent long days surrounded by intense scenes, emotional breakdowns, and difficult moments. When critics began questioning the film even before its release, Ron felt pressure building again. He wondered if he was doing justice to the real person behind the story. When the film was released, it became a major success. It won 4 Academy Awards, including Best Director for Ron. He stood on the stage accepting one of the highest honors in filmmaking. He thanked everyone with grace, smiled at the crowd, and held the award with pride. But inside, he did not feel as strong as people imagined. Behind, on the celebration, he felt tired, drained, and emotionally stretched thin. The process of making the film had taken more out of him than he expected. People often think that awards bring peace or confidence, but for Ron, they brought new expectations. Winning Best Director made him someone people saw as nearly flawless. From then on, many assumed that every film he made should reach the highest level. This pressure sat heavily on his shoulders. Every new project felt like another test, not a fresh opportunity. The applause that followed his wins did not erase the exhaustion, worry, or fear of failing the next time. As the years went on, the slow erosion of his energy became noticeable. He worked through long days, made countless decisions, and carried company responsibilities through Imagine Entertainment. The more successful he became, the less personal space he had. Family time shrank, rest became rare, and the pressure to maintain his reputation grew stronger. People praised his work ethic, but they didn't see the emotional cost behind it. He wanted each film to be perfect. This gave his work quality, but it also created cracks over time. Perfectionism meant he could never relax fully. There was always something to fix, review, or adjust. Even small mistakes felt big. Ron carried these worries quietly, without complaining, because he thought that was what leadership required. His reputation continued rising around the world. He was admired as a thoughtful, disciplined, and talented director. But the more recognition he received, the more he felt pushed into a corner where mistakes were not allowed. Every project felt like it carried the weight of all the ones before it. His success became a standard he felt he had to match each time. But Hollywood has a short memory, and the fall can come faster than anyone imagines. What do you do when one flop becomes two, and the world begins to wonder if you've already had your last great moment? For Ron Howard, the years after his major successes carried a quiet fear that slowly grew stronger. Even though he had achieved great respect, Hollywood is a place where past victories fade quickly. People move on fast, and one weak project can make a director feel like everything he built is slipping away. The first real blow came with EDTV in 1999. Ron believed in the film. It was creative, clever, and ahead of its time, but sometimes timing matters more than talent. When the movie opened, the numbers didn't come in with excitement or hope. They trickled in slowly, almost painfully. Each update felt heavier. Studios expected more. Critics wanted more. Viewers didn't connect with it the way he hoped. Instead of talking about the film's creativity, people focused on its disappointing performance. Ron took the failure personally. He blamed himself for choices he made, scenes he approved, and risks he took. The shame didn't come in loud ways. It came quietly, sitting in the back of his mind, reminding him that success in Hollywood is never guaranteed. He pushed forward, but the sting of EDTV stayed with him for years. Then, in 2008, he directed Frost, Nixon. The film earned strong reviews. Critics praised the acting, the writing, and Ron's direction. It was nominated for awards and earned respect across the industry. But even with all of this support, the movie struggled financially. It didn't fail dramatically, but it did not earn back what it cost to make. For Ron, the contrast was hard to accept. On one side, there was praise and recognition. On the other, disappointing numbers. He felt like he was giving everything he had, yet the results kept falling short of expectations. That pattern created a slow and uncomfortable fear. A full decade passed between EDTV and Frost, Nixon, but the feeling was the same. Ron worried that audiences were losing interest in his work. He wondered privately if he was slipping out of touch with what people wanted to see. He respected the industry deeply, but he also knew it was unforgiving. No matter how much success someone has earned in the past, Hollywood quickly looks for the next rising name. The fear of becoming outdated or unnecessary began to settle into his thoughts. It was not loud panic. It was a quiet, constant worry. Then came the most challenging moment of all, Solo, a Star Wars story in 2018. Ron did not start the project. He was invited in after the previous directors were removed, during production. The film already had problems, delays, and disagreements. He stepped into a situation already full of tension, pressure, and urgency. The studio needed stability, and Ron tried his best to provide it. But taking over mid-production meant he had to work incredibly fast. He ended up reshooting nearly 70% of the movie, an enormous task under any circumstances. Fans of the franchise also carried high expectations, and many were already divided before the film even came out. When Solo was released, the reaction was difficult. There was criticism from many directions. Online, discussions grew harsh. Analysts pointed out the financial losses. Headlines focused on what went wrong instead of what went right. The film became the first true box office disaster in Ron's long directing career. This time, the failure was not quiet. It was public. It was loud. Millions of Notherkamba. People saw headlines about the film losing tens of millions of dollars. Ron felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt since childhood, when he feared he would never escape the role of OP. He later admitted that the experience affected him so deeply that he seriously thought about walking away from directing for good. That level of doubt was rare for him, but the disappointment cut deeper than usual. It wasn't just about numbers, it was about the feeling of letting people down on a global stage. For someone who had worked since infancy to maintain professionalism, humility, and excellence, this moment was extremely painful. He had survived the pressure of Apollo 13, the emotional demands of a beautiful mind, and decades of responsibility at Imagine Entertainment. But Solo made him question whether the world still wanted the kinds of stories he loved to tell. The failure touched the same sensitive spot he had carried since he was a child. A fear of not being enough, not fitting in, not living up to expectations. Hollywood's reaction didn't make it easier. Respect in the film industry doesn't prevent cold judgment. The truth is simple. Hollywood focuses on what is profitable. Long-term legacy does not protect anyone when a project underperforms. Conversations in boardrooms turned serious. Analysts wrote articles questioning his future. Studio leaders became more cautious. People who once praised him began choosing safer words, gentler tones, and uncertain support. It wasn't cruelty. It was the industry's nature. But it made Ron feel more distant from the world he had dedicated his entire life to. These years, filled with hits and misses, taught him an uncomfortable truth. Success may be remembered, but failure is felt much more deeply. And when failures stack up, they leave scars. He carried the weight quietly, not blaming others, not looking for excuses. But inside, the doubt grew stronger. The fear that he might be fading away, that maybe he had already seen his final shining moment, became harder to ignore. Yet the harshest battles, they weren't happening on screens or in boardrooms, they were unfolding in his own home. The world saw a steady Hollywood marriage. They never saw the nights when silence nearly split it in two. Ron and Cheryl met young and built their relationship on simple beginnings, long before fame, big studios, or financial pressure entered their lives. They married in 1975, renting small places, sharing responsibilities, and living on a careful budget. Their early years were full of warmth, hope, and the feeling that they could build a life together even without much money. They had plans, dreams, and the belief that they would figure everything out side by side. When their first child, Bryce, was born in 1981, Ron felt overwhelming joy. He held his daughter with a sense of pride and love he had never felt before. Soon after came the twins, Paige and Jocelyn, in 1985, and their youngest, Reed. In 1987, the family grew quickly, and their home filled with noise, laughter, and the usual chaos that comes with young children. But behind the joy, there was also a difficult truth. Ron's career demanded constant time away. Film sets, long days, location shoots, deadlines, everything pulled for him farther from home. Cheryl was left raising 4 children almost on her own while Ron worked. At first, they both tried to handle it with patience. Cheryl understood that Ron needed to work to support their growing family, and Ron trusted Cheryl to care for the home. But as the years passed, the press, long absences began to create a quiet shift between them. Ron missed birthdays, school plays, bedtime stories, and countless small moments that build a family's memories. Cheryl shouldered more than anyone should have to, often feeling lonely even though she loved her children deeply. She cooked, cleaned, organized, and comforted, but the weight of doing everything alone slowly tired her more than she liked to admit. Ron felt guilty whenever he walked through the front door and realized he had missed another milestone. He wanted to be present, yet every film or project demanded a new level of focus. He tried to make up for lost time by being fully present during short breaks, but it never felt enough. Cheryl was understanding, but inside, she felt the growing distance. There were nights when they barely spoke, because both were exhausted. Ron from work, Cheryl from the house, and the children. It wasn't anger, it was quiet disappointment, the kind that settles in slowly and doesn't leave easily. The financial pressure during Ron's career setbacks made things even harder. When a film underperformed or failed, the burden reached their home. millions lost at the box office. He didn't stay in contracts or spreadsheets. They arrived in their living room as silent fears. Ron worried he was failing his family. Cheryl worried about losing stability. Neither wanted to stress the other, so both kept their fears inside. This unspoken pressure made their home feel heavy at times. They loved each other, but they were also carrying unseen emotional weight. The tension became clearer during the period after EDTV, and later after Solo. Ron would come home tense, withdrawn, and drained. Cheryl recognized the signs but didn't know how to reach him fully. In these moments, the marriage felt stretched thin. They weren't fighting loudly. Instead, they were drifting, pulled apart by stress, guilt, and exhaustion. Ron felt like he was letting everyone down, and Cheryl felt like she was losing the closeness they once had. The breaking point came during one particularly difficult period when Ron returned home overwhelmed. The pressure of work, the fear of declining success, and the guilt of being absent built up until he couldn't hide it anymore. He sat down one evening and broke emotionally. Years of holding everything together finally cracked. Cheryl found him, with his head in his hands, unable to speak without his voice shaking. It was the first time she had seen him completely vulnerable in this way. Ron was always the calm one, the steady one, but at that moment, he felt lost. Cheryl didn't react with frustration. She reacted with love. She sat beside him, held his hand, and listened. She didn't judge him or push him away. She knew that behind this collapse was a man who carried his responsibilities too heavily and too quietly. She reminded him that she wasn't with him for his success, reputation, or career. She was with him because of who he was at his core. Her support didn't fix everything instantly, but it became a turning point. After that night, they slowly began rebuilding their communication. Ron opened up more about what he was feeling. Cheryl shared her own fears instead of hiding them. They had long conversations, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning, about what they wanted from their marriage and how they could protect it better. They admitted that they had let stress take control and that they needed to work together again, the way they did in the early years. Ron also made more effort to be present even when his schedule was difficult. He took red-eye flights just to get home for a night. He made sure he called the children and Cheryl more regularly. Cheryl, in return, understood his world a little more deeply and continued offering support wrapped in honesty, rather than quiet frustration. Their marriage didn't heal overnight, but it strengthened again because both chose effort over distance. Their long marriage eventually taught them something many couples never learn. Love isn't about never facing pressure. It's about choosing each other even when pressure tries to pull you apart. Ron and Cheryl proved this to themselves again and again. Over the decades, they faced stress, money problems, loneliness, and emotional distance, but they also returned to one another every time because their foundation was built on respect and loyalty. No, marriage stays perfect through the years, especially under the spotlight, but theirs survived because they never allowed silence to become their final answer. They talked, listened, and stayed. And with time, they rediscovered what brought them together in the first place, a deep connection that outlasted fame and difficulty. But even marriage couldn't protect him from the storm rising within his own family bloodline. Saving someone you love is one kind of heartbreak. Losing the people who built you is another entirely. Ron Howard learned both lessons in the most personal and painful in ways. His younger brother, Clint Howard, had been by his side since childhood. They grew up on the same sets, walked through the same studios, and understood each other in ways only siblings raised in Hollywood could. Clint was kind, thoughtful, and gentle, but adulthood brought struggles he never expected. Over time, he slipped into addiction, first alcohol, then drugs. It didn't happen overnight. It was a slow slide built on stress, loneliness, and choices that led him down a dangerous path. Ron watched this change with growing fear. He saw the spark in Clint's eyes slowly disappear. He heard the shaky voice on difficult phone calls. He noticed when apologies became more frequent and less clear. Addiction doesn't just affect the person using it, affects everyone around them. Ron felt helpless watching his brother lose control. He wanted to fix it, but addiction is not something anyone else can fix. It must be faced by the person living through it. The breaking point came one night when Clint reached out in a panic. His words were scattered, his emotions unstable, and his fear impossible to hide. Ron realized that if he didn't step in firmly, he could lose his brother forever. Sitting across from Clint, he delivered the hardest sentence he had ever spoken. "Rehab, or I lose you." It wasn't said in anger. It was said with love, fear, and the hope that tough honesty could save a life. Clint looked at him, defeated and exhausted, and said yes. The moment began a long, painful recovery. Rehab wasn't a quick fix. It required months of treatment, emotional struggle, and rebuilding trust. Clint had to learn to live again, without substances. Ron supported him quietly, checking on him and offering encouragement. Over the years, Clint rebuilt his life step by step. He returned to acting, repaired relationships, and became stronger. Ron later said that seeing his brother survive brought him a kind of relief he could never fully describe. Helping Clint stay alive was one of the hardest and most important things he ever faced. But while he regained his brother, he soon lost the two people who had shaped every part of his life, or his parents. His mother, Jean, was the gentle center of his childhood. She protected him through the pressures of early fame and taught him how to stay calm in a world full of noise. As she grew older, her health began to weaken. There were small signs at first: shortness of breath, fatigue, and discomfort she tried to hide. Ron wanted to believe she was fine, but her heart began to struggle. When she was hospitalized due to heart complications, Ron sat by her side, remembering the woman who stood behind the curtain at his childhood performances, whispering encouragement when he was scared. Losing her in 2000 felt like losing a part of his foundation. Her death hit him harder than he expected. It reopened memories of his early years, the studio trailers, the long workdays, the moments she comforted him when he felt alone. He carried her voice and her kindness with him, but the grief was heavy. The world still saw him as strong, but inside he felt hollow. Not long after, his father, Rance, began declining too. Rance had been a steady presence, someone who gave Ron strength and direction. He had guided him through acting, walked him through difficult moments, and taught him about discipline and honesty. But age, heart issues, and cognitive decline slowly took away the man Ron had known. Seeing his father struggle with memory and clarity was painful. Ron visited him often, sitting beside him, even when conversations grew shorter and confusion grew stronger. When Rance passed away in 2017, Ron felt a deep emotional collapse. Losing both parents left him feeling unanchored. These were the people who raised him, protected him, and helped him become who he was, without. For them, the world felt quieter, colder, and less familiar. He no longer had the safe place of calling home for comfort. The grief settled deep into him, and he understood that life had permanently changed. Just when he thought he understood grief, another loss arrived, unexpected and sharp. Cindy Williams, his friend and co-star from American Graffiti, passed away in 2023. They had shared an important part of their youth, working together during a time when everything felt bright and full of possibilities. Cindy had a warm, friendly energy that made long nights on set feel easier. Even though they didn't see each other often later in life, their bond never disappeared. When Ron learned of her passing, the sadness hit in a different way. It wasn't just the loss of a friend, it was the loss of a piece of his past. Her death reminded him that the early chapters of his life were closing forever. These losses forced him to face a reality many people eventually reach. Youth doesn't leave all at once. It leaves one goodbye at a time. A parent, a friend, a memory, they disappear slowly, and suddenly the world looks different. Surviving the people who shaped you brings a deep kind of loneliness. Ron carried that loneliness quietly. He still worked, still loved his family, still pushed forward, but he felt the weight of time more than ever. The people who knew him before fame, before responsibilities, before adulthood, were now gone. That kind of emptiness doesn't show in public, but it lives inside. Yet, even in the darkness of grief, life had one final transformation waiting, one that would redefine what legacy truly means. After all the storms, after all the reinventions, what remains when a man finally earns the right to slow down? For Ron Howard, his later years became a chapter built not on pressure, but on peace. After more than 6 decades in Hollywood, his life finally reached a point where he no longer had to prove anything. He had created films that touched millions, survived career setbacks, protected his family through difficult moments, and rebuilt himself after each painful loss. Now, at this stage, he could finally breathe. Today, Ron's net worth is estimated at around $200 million. The number sounds glamorous, but for him, it reflects a lifetime of steady work rather than sudden wealth. It came from directing, producing, decades of syndication, his long-term business partnership with Brian Grazer, and careful financial decisions. It was not earned through luck. It was built through years of effort, discipline, and long hours behind the camera. His real estate quietly shows the journey he has lived. For, in many years, his main home was a beautiful 32-acre property in Greenwich, Connecticut. The land offered privacy, quiet woods, and a lake where the family spent calm afternoons. He also owned a home in Los Angeles, built with clean design and warm lighting, a place filled with memories from decades in the industry. In Manhattan, he kept an apartment with tall windows that opened to city views, giving him a peaceful escape during work trips. None of these homes were about showing off. They were places where his family grew, gathered, and healed. His cars tell the same story. He kept his old Volkswagen Beetle from his youth, not because it was impressive, but because it reminded him of simpler days. He enjoyed a few vintage convertibles from the 1962nd and 1972nd, and he owned a Ferrari FF. But Ron was never someone who collected luxury just for attention. The cars he kept were chosen because he truly appreciated them, not because he wanted to be seen in them. He lived comfortably, not loudly. What mattered most to Ron in these years wasn't wealth or possessions. It was his family. His children were all grown now, each building their own life. Bryce Dallas Howard became a commonplace, successful actress and director. Paige continued working in entertainment. Jocelyn chose a quieter path outside the spotlight. Reed became a steady and grounded member of the family. Ron watched his children with pride, knowing they had grown into kind, hard-working adults. They visited often, filled his home with conversation, and brought their children, Ron's grandchildren, who brought new energy and laughter. These family moments meant more to him than any film premiere or award ceremony. He enjoyed slow mornings with Cheryl, sharing coffee, talking about small things, or simply enjoying the quiet. Their marriage had survived hardship, absence, pressure, and emotional distance. Yet now it rested in a calm place. They had rebuilt understanding and found comfort in routines that once felt impossible. After years of rushing, Ron found joy in doing nothing. A walk, a simple meal, or a quiet afternoon with Cheryl felt like gifts. Ron continued to give generously, but quietly. He supported film students, funded scholarships, contributed to hospitals, and helped veteran programs. He also supported young filmmakers who came from simple backgrounds. he never announced these donations publicly. He believed that kindness shouldn't always be tied to attention. Giving privately made him feel closer to the lessons his parents taught him about humility and gratitude. Directing still played a role in his life, but it had changed. He no longer chased big projects or he tried to prove anything to studios. He took on films only when they felt meaningful. If a story spoke to him, he worked on it. If not, he stepped back. He allowed himself to rest without guilt. After decades of pushing, he finally understood that his value was not connected to constant productivity. Life had taught him that peace mattered too. In these later years, Ron began seeing legacy differently. Awards, nominations, and box office numbers were part of his story, but not the heart of it. He realized that real legacy comes from how you touch people, not how they criticize or praise your work, but how they feel because of you. He knew that his films brought comfort, hope, learning, and inspiration to many. He also knew that the relationships he nurtured meant far more than any trophy in a glass case. The respect he earned from colleagues, the love he earned from family, and the generosity he showed to others mattered far more than fame ever could. Ron often reflected on the long road he traveled. He survived childhood fame, career pressure, financial fear, emotional exhaustion, and painful loss. He had overcome doubts, rebuilt confidence, and learned how to start again in different stages of life. His story wasn't perfect, but it was honest, and through all the challenges, he learned the value of endurance. He learned that strength doesn't always look loud or brave. Sometimes it looks like patience, consistency, and quiet determination. There are lessons in Ron's life that speak to anyone going through challenges. One lesson is that success doesn't protect you from hardship. Another is that you can fall many times and still rise again. And maybe the most important lesson is that relationships, the people who walk with you through the hardest years, are what truly matter. Fame is temporary. Family, kindness, and character last longer than any spotlight. As he looked at his grandchildren, watched his children pursue their paths, and spent peaceful mornings with Cheryl, Ron understood clearly that he had built a life worth being proud of, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. His later years were not about chasing achievements. They were about enjoying the life he had worked so hard to build. Because in the end, the truest story of Ron Howard isn't about fame. It's about what a man becomes after, surviving everything meant to break him.